Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Clark. I'm the president and founder at Ascent, and thrilled to be here with Matt Kelly, the editor and CEO of Radical Compliance, kicking off another Compliance Over Coffee, elevating voices from around the industry, those who work in, around, and with different lines of defense. And today we're going to turn the tables a bit. Someone who writes about the compliance and risk industry day in, day out, has a background doing that. So first of all, welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, sure, Brian. Happy to be here, and hello to everybody who's going to be listening to us.
So, obviously, you're the CEO of Radical Compliance, and you write quite a bit about the industry. I'd love to hear and start with, how did Radical Compliance come to be, and maybe a little bit about your background, which is fascinating.
Sure. So I've been running Radical Compliance for 5 years now. We just hit the 5-year mark. And it is first and foremost a newsletter and blog for corporate compliance officers about what is going on in the field. I have a newsletter that comes out once a week, and my blog comes out a couple of times throughout the week as news dictates. But it's one part news that has happened and one part analysis about here is what are probably the lessons other compliance officers would want to take away from what we just saw. And sometimes it could be an enforcement action, it could be a big speech from a regulator, it could just be some interesting thing in the news that is emblematic of interesting challenges that actually are ethics and compliance challenges when you think about them. Like I said, I've been doing that since the start of 2016. I've actually drifted into this field way back when I was a newspaper reporter, and then I drifted into writing about business and technology and startups and capital formation and whatnot. And right after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in 2002, some very innovative guys in Boston, where I live, they launched Compliance Week magazine. I wound up writing for them starting early 2003, I think, and then wound up at Compliance Week. I was a writer there for a few years. I was editor of it for 10, and then finally decided I wanted to scale back a bit and publish my own newsletter. And so I started that in 2016. I've been doing it ever since. And the blog is open to everybody. It's free. I don't really charge any consulting fees or subscription fees or anything like that. So if you like it, you can come and you can give it a read. You can sign up for the newsletter. If you have ideas about what's going on that I should be writing about, I'm always looking for that. I like a good bit of gossip. Who is taking what jobs? Who is leaving what jobs? All sorts of stuff like that. So whatever is of interest to the compliance community, that's what I like to talk about, and that's what I'm doing.
Excellent. Well, that's a good dovetail, obviously, into what is the mission of Radical Compliance. So what's the most important thing that you're bringing to the industry that you hope people are taking away from what you're creating?
Oh, well, okay, I'll get in trouble for saying this, but I will. I like to bring a certain dose of practical realism to what we are writing about. And that is not something that everybody in compliance can do, because they have constraints about, we don't want to say this to offend my employer. We don't want to say that to offend this other constituency. So we try to be genteel about things. I do try to put a bit of a more real take on what is this news? What is this teachable moment? Nobody likes to talk about the fact that compliance and HR often fight like cats and dogs. Compliance and legal often fight like brother and sister. There are definite difficulties in what I would call the broader corporate culture and values, specifically in the United States right now. We just went through a very divisive political election. How do those kind of issues actually affect large companies with many different types of people? And, we saw a lot of misconduct from the Trump administration. How are you supposed to deal with that? And I like to write about like community stuff, for lack of a better word. Every Friday, I put out a roundup of just who's taking what jobs. And, is it news you can use? Not necessarily. Is it news that's worth knowing? Because the compliance is a fairly small group of people and we like to support each other. Yeah, in that case, it really is very interesting. That's the best part of my job, is to just talk with other compliance officers about what are you doing, what are you hearing, what's some interesting gossip. And a lot of it is somewhat removed from the big enforcement action everybody else writes about. And I just like to, I love the profession, I'll put it that way. I think the challenges compliance professionals deal with are endlessly fascinating at an intellectual level. They deal with technology and ethics and public policy and some practical details around budgets and corporate compliance and legal investigations. And you can ping pong back and forth like that for endlessly. And that's probably what I do. That's the mission, is just to figure out what's important to compliance officers and talk about that stuff. That's it.
Excellent. And I like the radical approach to factual information. Certainly a benefit in this day and age when it's hard to sift through a lot and try to determine what is accurate and what isn't. So, you know, I can just harken back to my days as a compliance officer. Oftentimes sifting through that information was the hardest part of the job. So appreciate the background and looking forward to diving in here. So let's kind of take that as a first step. And you remarked how there are a lot of different areas across compliance, you know, ethics, technology, et cetera. And we've seen it evolve really as part of this 3 lines of defense. Mm-hmm. So you started covering the space, you know, a number of years ago, almost 2 decades. But the relationship between regulatory compliance and technology has been kind of the 2 of the pillars, right, for these 3 lines of defense. How has the relationship between those 2 things evolved?
In fits and starts with a lot of difficulty. That's how it has evolved. And what I mean is that, you know, let's say 20 years ago, regulatory compliance was very much an exercise that happened at fixed intervals. You had a quarterly report that had to be submitted, and you waited until about 3 or 4 weeks ahead of the deadline. You pulled all the data together, you filled out the form correctly, you filed it. Get back to me next quarter. That was regulatory compliance. That was SEC reporting. And what we have seen really, I think, change the most is that compliance now has to happen in real time. What I mean is that if you correctly document at the end of the quarter that you've had a mess for the last 90 days or 2 periods, or you have a financial restatement, your situation has not improved by filing the report on time and correctly. Nobody's going to care. Everybody's going to focus on, why did you not have this effective system all the way through? And that's true whether we're talking about internal control for financial reporting, it's whether we're talking about anti-corruption systems, records management and data capture. It has to be working all the way through. And the way it works is with technology that actually is effective day in and day out. And if you have flawed technology, you're going to have a really big problem. I don't know when it will become really big or when you will discover that it's really big. That might be the better way to put it, but you have a big problem. So it is much more about making sure the technology to implement the policies and procedures works all the time. It is designed effectively and it achieves its end. And you get feedback data to make sure that, yes, the system is working well for all of the risks that we have and the regulatory obligations that we have. And it has to work well day in, day out. And you find out at the end of the quarter that you had poor access controls that nobody bothered to fix, and you have a giant data breach now that you have to report. Like I said, filing the notice in a timely manner is not going to win over anybody, not your customers, not your board, not the CEO. The first thing they're all going to ask is, how did we allow this to happen? How did we not know this happened? That's what compliance is today. And it is hell and gone from what I described 2 minutes ago about what it was like in, say, 1995, when it was just filing a report on time.
This notion of continuous compliance is obviously something that's started to increase recently, and I want to bucket these into people, process, and technology. Is the technology the result of the problems that are occurring? Is it the processes that are the result of the problems occurring, or is it maybe a bit of people's resistance to using these new things? What's your view with what you've seen?
Well, I'm actually a big fan of the technology, and don't get me wrong, I know that configuring the IT system for a large organization is not easy. It's nobody's idea of a good time. But as one CFO once told me, I overheard him speaking at a data security conference. They were talking about how they were going to design their internal accounting system, and they were using a cloud-based vendor. I'm not going to name the vendor, but one of the biggest around. And the sales engineers came and said, look, we can engineer this system to do whatever you want to do for internal accounting and compliance. And the CFO said to the crowd, it's like, oh Christ, now I actually have to know what I want to do, because the technology is going to do whatever I want it to do. And there was a lot of wisdom in that statement. I'm not sure he understood that, but I think the biggest challenge for a lot of organizations is developing a clear sense of the roles and responsibilities we want to have in place to fulfill our business objectives and our regulatory compliance objectives and cybersecurity and operations and all this other stuff. We have to decide what we want to do, and then we have to decide who are the right people to have in place. What are their jobs going to be? How do we sort all of this out? And then then the technology becomes much easier to use to achieve all of your ends. But if you don't know what you're actually wanting to do, and if you don't know who does what, then all the technology is going to be a really whiz-bang mess. You're going to have duplication of effort. You're going to have data that's not getting updated. You're going to have people, occasionally you'll have people deliberately engaging in misconduct. You're not going to find it, or you're not going to hold them accountable, and then that's not going to look good. So I tend to say first, it's more about sorting out who are the people we want and the processes that we're going to have, and then the technology can come in later on. But there's not going to be a circumstance where the tech can't do what you want. It's just the tech you're going to have to figure out what you want the tech to do. And that's deceptively hard for a lot of large organizations.
Well, and to your point, right, it's a magnifying glass. And whatever you point it at, it's going to magnify or automate or operate. So
exactly.
Let's
if
drill in here a little bit more.
If you have flawed roles and responsibilities, the tech is just going to accelerate all of the flaws and make them that much more widespread. So that's the part where I think a lot about that is, how do you map out the roles and responsibilities and then design your tech to support all of that, and then you'll be in good shape.
Well, and to that point, we've talked a little bit before about risk and compliance, right? And it's interesting to see everything go into risk. I guess I always think about risk as the new ops, right? Everything's a quantified risk now. But how do you see the relationship between risk and compliance in the second line in particular start to take hold and maybe differentiate it from the first line, right? So how are you breaking down these buckets as these relationships evolve?
See, I think that we are at an interesting point in that, because the answer I would have given you 10 years ago is different than the one today. And I think the answer I'd give you in 2030 would be a lot different than what I would give you right now. But I think a lot of businesses are struggling to really develop effective enterprise risk management. That's not necessarily the case with banks and financial firms, who are a bit more mature. And I know that that's largely where we want to go with this conversation. So I'll get back to financial firms in a moment. But a lot of businesses start with regulatory compliance because that's a tangible thing. We have these laws we must obey. We need to come up with a way to do that. So let's do it. And they start with compliance. And then they start to realize, well, the procedures that we use to manage compliance issues are going to feel very similar for other types of risk, operational risk and liquidity risk. And maybe we can soup this up to be much more of a risk management function, and compliance evolves into a risk management function for a lot of businesses. For financial firms, they've already had regulatory compliance and risk for a long time, and those have been fairly well defined. So I do wonder how that is going to shake out. Like, people will sometimes ask, do I envision that compliance and risk are going to merge into one thing? Not really, but a lot of compliance officers will answer into the risk officer. And is that good or bad? I don't know. I kind of frown on it because I'm used to saying compliance should always report directly to the CEO or the board. But a lot of what financial firms would have to do to manage risk, like compliance risk is one subset of it. So why wouldn't you have those sort of drift into being one unified function, especially if the technology is going to allow that? You could get away with it if you tried. Yeah, I could see any number of CFOs thinking this is a good cost cutting move. Let's see if we could do it. And since we're talking about the three lines of defense, before I get back to the first line, I also want to talk about the third line, internal audit. This is something else I think about a lot, is that internal audit, what do? Well, they examine processes to find flaws and recommend improvements. And what does the board tell internal audit to do? They tell them, we want more data analytics, we want more detection of emerging risks and more real-time monitoring of risks because of data analytics. So if internal audit is moving from an occasional pass at an operating division and auditing this or that or the other thing, if they're moving away from that to building data-driven algorithms that can monitor the risk at all times, it's going to monitor it for me, the internal auditor, right now while I'm auditing it, but then I'm going to leave the algorithm with you, business unit. You can monitor your own risk, and you can call me back in a year, or when things get weird in the data, I'll come and I'll help you. But if internal audit is becoming more of, frankly, something that can build risk management tools and then leave them behind, what's the difference between that and the risk officer? Because, really, that's what we want to get at here. So I do think there's going to be a lot more overlapping of internal audit and risk management, primarily because the tech is going to allow us to do it. And that's when I say, I'll give you a very different answer in 2030. I know there's a lot of questions around who reports to whom, or who gets voted off the island, or, is the audit executive going to be a souped up enterprise risk management executive and they handle compliance too? Like, I don't know, but I could see scenarios where that would work. Financial services being the one exception because they are so highly regulated and they do need internal audit functions. And, I can't envision a scenario where we get rid of that. But there's a lot of, the technology is going to allow a lot of convergence on your ability to manage risk. And then back to finally, and then I promise I'll take a breath. The first line of defense people, I see a lot of questions there about, are they assessing and managing their risks effectively? When, let's not forget, they're first and foremost, they're paid to do an operation. They're not paid necessarily to manage risk. They're paid to make sales, develop new technologies, or open new markets, or anything like that. So there's going to be a tension between risk management people in the first line of defense who are they doing that with enough sophistication? And then risk or compliance in the second line, they show up to tell you, well, you're doing it wrong. You should do it this way or that way. How do those risk people work well? There's a lot of tension there. I've seen very specific enforcement actions where the regulators came in and said, what you did is not what we want. We could talk about some of those actions if we want, but there's a lot of, like I've said before, it's about roles and responsibilities. There's a lot of overlap and confusion there. The technology is going to allow you to do a lot more. Question is understanding exactly what you can do, just because the technology would let you do
it. I think that's a great point. And we've often, and I guess if I would summarize what I'm hearing from you and kind of what we've seen, is risk is looking at something before it happens, compliance is monitoring while it's happening, and audit's looking at it after it happens. But you're all looking at the same thing. And it's all the same common denominator, which is the activity of the company in its day-to-day operations. And
Absolutely.
There is a melding, and we have, to your point, we've seen this across organizations where different people with different titles do the same work as someone at a different organization. And so, it probably will shake out that way. And I will be interested, hopefully we're having a very different conversation in 10 years, in person, certainly.
I'll be here.
That's excellent. Let's switch gears. In light of that, in person, actually, we prepped on Talking about COVID a little bit, and obviously there's been a lot of changes, some temporary, some permanent. And wanted to ask a little bit more about what types of challenges that you've been keeping track of that clients are going to have in light of the COVID pandemic, and then maybe a little bit more about how it's going to impact us in the future.
So a lot of the challenges happened. There are two different types of challenges. Way back when the pandemic first started, the challenge was just figuring out any technology we could use to keep the operation going. And then almost immediately thereafter, they realized, whoa, we've got a lot of cybersecurity challenges around that. We have a lot of regulatory compliance challenges around that. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was talking to an audit committee chair of a publicly traded software company. And she told me, she's like, did we have some meetings, audit committee meetings by Zoom before the pandemic? She's like, will we use Zoom to talk? She's like, yeah, of course we did. To ask where we would get lunch, because we all said, well, we'd never be so nuts to actually have a full board meeting on Zoom until we were having a full board meeting on Zoom because we didn't know what else to do. And there was a lot of that at the beginning of the pandemic. It's like, oh crap, we need to figure this out right now, just how to communicate. And then almost immediately they lurched into, well, we can't meet on Zoom. We need to figure out the cybersecurity implications of this. So there was a lot of panic, I'll just say panic, a lot of hurry up and panic about cybersecurity, about record keeping. If you are, say, a broker-dealer firm, you're regulated by FINRA, you've got a lot of employee surveillance and record keeping to keep track of. Well, how would you do that if suddenly, you told all your employees over the course of a weekend, don't come into the office until further notice, and use your private Wi-Fi network and maybe use your laptop and your cell phone to work with the clients? Like, nobody ever thought that we would have that scenario. So there was a lot of figuring out how do we normalize new risk management around cybersecurity, around regulatory compliance, specifically for record keeping, surveillance, employee supervision. FINRA was one of the very few regulators that actually had good pandemic relevant guidance before the pandemic came along. They published a spruced up, refreshed version of it in March of 2020 that was enormously helpful because they were the only ones who'd ever actually thought about it. But then there was this period throughout most of 2020 where I think a lot of compliance and IT people were realizing, all right, we have people using 19 different apps on 5 different networks and devices, and we have no idea what they are yet. And we need to normalize what all of this will be so the employees can do their job from wherever they are, and so that we can capture all the relevant data, which is going to be on different apps, on different devices, in different formats and different networks. And I know one technology attorney who worked with a client where literally they spent 7 hours on a Saturday going through 11 different apps, turning on and off all of the features of each app to confirm that how they used it would be in compliance with FINRA rules. I think that person deserves hazard pay for spending a weekend doing that. It sounds like the most mind-numbing task known to man, but they had to do that, and so do many others. I think where we are now is that I hope most firms have sort of figured out how to make this work, and they can achieve regulatory compliance as much as they needed at the moment. But now we are trying to figure out, as we return to work, how are we going to straddle both back in the office and at home? There's a lot of people who I think are never going to go back to the office because going to the office sucks in many different ways. And if you want to let employees work from home, that's going to have some big fundamental questions, and we can talk about what those questions are. But a lot of firms right now at the start of 2021 are trying to figure out, what does return to work actually mean? We're not going to return physically to a location all that often. So how do we make permanent systemic changes to who we are as a business? What does that mean for regulatory compliance? And how do we use our tech to get all that compliance done? That's where they are right now. I mean, I could go on about COVID implications all day long, as you can tell, But that's a lot of it. It was a mad scramble, then it was a less mad scramble, and now it's going from plain old scramble to steady stride forward. That's going to be the life cycle here.
Yep, great. And so a lot of probably changes still on the horizon. What do you see that is going to impact the space in next year? We talked a little bit about the administration, but just a bit of a forward-looking view to your point. What thoughts on the new administration, for example? Obviously, we're going to see some changes this year.
I think it's very clear we're going to see more rigorous enforcement, specifically from the people who seem destined to lead the Office of the Comptroller in the Currency and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The Biden administration nominees for that, they have yet to be confirmed, but I don't see why they won't be confirmed. Neither one of these gentlemen are any slouches at enforcement, and a lot of people Joe Biden is going to put into place now came of age during the financial crisis when the Dodd-Frank Act was passed. We had these sweeping ideas of what we would do. Second half of the Obama administration, that ran into a reality where Republican Congress really clipped their wings. But now all of these people who cut their teeth forming Dodd-Frank and thinking really big, now they're going to be in charge of actual executive agencies. And so we're going to see a lot more enforcement. That is true with the Securities and Exchange Commission, OCC, and the CFPB, probably some other regulatory agencies I can't even think of. And that's just regular issues enforced more rigorously. The other thing that I think is going to happen is we're going to see some new issues land on companies' desks. The biggest two are going to be more discussion of climate change and how firms are addressing climate change risks, and diversity and inclusion and how businesses are doing that. And in both of those, banking regulators have already said they want much more disclosure from financial firms about how they're thinking that issue through, well, those issues through. I think we're going to see a push from the agencies for really specific disclosures. I think what we will see is the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, will move to adopt a specific disclosure framework for climate change and social issues, the same way that for SOX compliance in accounting controls, you're supposed to use the COSO framework. I know that's not written in the law, it's just the SEC pointed at it, so everybody followed it, and now we all use COSO for financial reporting. I suspect the SEC is going to start pointing to specific frameworks for climate change and diversity. We're all going to start using those. And, well, how do you get that data? How do you capture it? How are you using a framework to amend your policies and procedures? How are you overseeing your selection of third parties to make sure that you can capture all the relevant data from them? It's going to be a lot of that, on top of the more rigorous enforcement we're going to see, on top of the deep philosophical changes in business because we're coming out of a pandemic. So that's a lot. And we could go on from there, but I think that's enough for 1 year, but that's what's going to land on a lot of firms in 2021.
Sounds like more than enough. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that's bandied about a lot is, especially in light of the remote work and you know, some of these questions about developments is how do you possibly keep up with everything? How do you have the resources to do this? And in particular, I'm interested in your take on outsourcing compliance, right? Obviously, it's outside of the four walls of the organization. But what are the benefits of bringing people in, stick specifically to people, versus some of the risks of bringing those outsiders in?
Well, yeah, I go back and forth on the ideas of outsourcing compliance. Because if we're talking about outsourcing an entire compliance function, and there are those people out there who say you can do it, I would respectfully say the regulators don't care that you've outsourced compliance. If you're the company that had the regulatory infraction, liability lies with you, not with your outsourced team that dropped the ball. So until that fundamental fact of life in corporate law changes, and it's not going to, I don't know that we're going to outsource all compliance functions. On the other hand, outsourcing some compliance capabilities, I think there probably is a lot of room for that. Managing, say, outsourced outsourced employee surveillance and employee communication. That's probably going to be good. Like there's a lot of technology service providers who will be able to rush in and offer some help with compliance duties. Where do we draw the line between you're a vendor providing a service and outsourced compliance? I don't know. I sometimes say that's a distinction without a real difference. Ultimately, the board and the CEOs are just going to want to know, is our compliance program effective? Do the capabilities we need to have, do they work? Do they work reliably? And if the answer is yes, then after that, I think the board starts to care a lot less about exactly how we got to that point of capability. Just they want to know that it's there. But you could outsource investigation functions. You could outsource employee monitoring. Could you outsource the whole kit and caboodle? I suppose you could. You'd be pretty brave. You'd be braver than me. But there's a lot of collaboration with service providers to build a strong compliance capability. That's where I would keep coming back to. It's really about, at the end of the day, you're going to have to be able to do a few things. How you do it, like, look, the regulators don't really care that much so long as you do it well and it works. So how you do it, you can structure it any way you want, but it's more, what will I need to be able to do? And those questions tend to be pretty simple when you sit down and think about them.
So let's kind of round out with this discussion of regulators. What developments do you think we'll see from them that risk and compliance should be keeping an eye on in this calendar year? What has happened? Where are we going? What do you see?
I think some of the best ways to figure out where they're going is to look at enforcement actions themselves. This is no secret here. So OCC took a major enforcement action against Citigroup last summer. They fined them $400 million for poor risk management and compliance risk management and data governance. And I wound up writing a very long series about all the ways that OCC wanted Citigroup to improve. And you can tell a lot from that. Take the regulators at their word when they impose a $400 million fine and say, this is what you're doing wrong. They mean it. Read the action and think about what the corrective plans are that are in those enforcement actions, and then say, can we do that in advance so we don't wind up in that same boat? You can see in a related way, the Federal Trade Commission, not long ago, they took an enforcement action against Zoom for statements about their data security that the FTC has said were misleading. And a minority dissent there from the Democrats on the FTC laid out in really rich detail what they would like to see for data governance and statements about data governance and how the FTC should enforce against statements about data security. And again, take a regulator at their word. When they publish a 13-page dissenting statement that goes into detail about, well, if I were in charge, I would do this, that's a clue. That's where you would look to see where they're laying down markers for what they want. I should add, the person who wrote that Federal Trade Commission dissent against Zoom, Rohit Chopra, he is now the nominee for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I expect he's going to get in. Take him at his word that he's got some very bold ideas about how to have consumer enforcement. I think we're going to see them. I'm all for a good speech. I'm all for a good policy position that the Justice Department publishes, but you'd be surprised at what you can glean from enforcement actions a lot. They offer a lot of detail about what remedial actions they want. Get ahead of that so that you're not going to be the one who's doing the remediating. You've already had your plan in place, and that's how you can avoid these things. But that's where you figure out where the enforcement is coming.
Excellent. Well, great insights, Matt, and just wanted to express our thanks for having you as a guest today. I appreciate you taking the time. Any parting thoughts before we close?
I would just want to actually circle back to one thing about return to work. I think there's a lot of deep philosophical questions businesses need to ask themselves right now. Are we going to return to life as normal in 2019? No. What are we going to do? How much are we going to have people back? Are we going to shrink our footprint? Are we going to let people work from home? And then you, the compliance officer, pay attention to those deliberations and discussions and answers, and then think through, if these are the strategic choices the business is making now about who we're going to be as a company, what does that mean for my compliance program? What are the implications for compliance, and how do I get my compliance processes and technologies and everything? How do I get that all lined up to support the answers that we have? I hope we can have good, thoughtful conversations about that now, because if we don't, we're going to find out by like the fall or 2022 that a lot of compliance is out of position for the new risks, for the new types of businesses that we have post-pandemic. That's what worries me. That's my soapbox. I'll get off it, but it's been great to talk with you all. So thank you, Brian, for having me on.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really appreciate you taking the time. And for everyone else, stay tuned. We'll have another installment of Compliance to Coffee next time. Take care. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.